Today on All Sports Central, we'll be going over our second college football schedule preview of the season, and it's going to be over the Florida Gators. And this was a team in 2019 that ended up going 11-2. They hardly disappointed at all. And overall, in this video, we're going to be going over a few players that this team will be losing in this offseason, who they're going to be returning, and also we're going to be going over their schedule for the first time this offseason. Starting off with the games that this team has had since November, we start off with the November 2nd game at home against Georgia. They lost by a touchdown in that game, but overall, they gave up a pretty good fight considering that Georgia, they were one of the better teams of the 2019 season, no doubt. The next week, they shut up Vanderbilt 56-0, pretty good win there. They also had a good win against Missouri on the road, 23-6. They destroyed Florida State on November 30th, 40-17, and then exactly a month later, they beat Virginia in the Orange Bowl, 36-28. So overall, don't let that score fool you either. Florida dominated most of that game. It was just Virginia at the end that tried to make a little bit of a comeback, which they did a pretty good job of doing that. But in the end, Florida dominated the Orange Bowl. Looking at your trends for the season, from September to October, they were 7-1. And from November to the postseason, they were 4-1. So overall, considering the November month in the postseason obviously is your toughest part of the season, well, usually, that's pretty good. 7-1 to 4-1. This is a pretty consistent team, or that we saw last season, and it'll be interesting to see how they're able to do that in the 2020 season. Here's some key points as well for this team heading into the offseason. They returned Kyle Trask at quarterback, and of course he filled in for Felipe Franks when he got injured at the very beginning of the season. And once Felipe Franks went down, I didn't think that Florida would even have a shot at getting 10 wins. But overall, this team really surprised me. They had a really good season, and Kyle Trask was very impressive overall. Now, he had 2,900 yards in the time that he played, 25 touchdowns, and 7 interceptions. So overall, if he can knock down a few of those interceptions, I think Kyle Trask is going to be bound for a really good 2020 season. Next up, they lose their top running back, Limical Pirine, which, of course, he had 938 total yards and 11 touchdowns last season. So he was used a decent amount. That's going to be a tough loss, of course. But I think in the end, they do return their second running back, Dameon Pierce, who had 335 total yards and 4 touchdowns. So overall, it looks like he will take over at the running back position. But I think this passing game is going to be taking a hit. They lose their top 2 wide receivers, Jefferson and Swain. Of course, Van Jefferson had over 600 yards and 6 touchdowns. And then Swain had over 500 yards and 7 touchdowns. So overall, both those wide receivers led this group pretty consistently. And overall, they still have a couple of wide receivers that can be very useful for them. But of course, they do return their your third wide receiver in Trevon Grimes. And of course, he had a pretty good season as well. He had nearly 500 yards and 3 touchdowns. They also returned their top tight end in Kyle Pitts, which he was a big receiver for Kyle Trask last season. He had over 600 yards and 5 touchdowns. He was actually the second. He was second in receiving yards for this Florida team last season. So that's going to be very helpful for Kyle Trask and this Florida team to have him back. They do lose one on the offensive line, which is not really bad at all. Most teams lose at least one. But they do lose 2 on the defensive line, which could be a bit of a problem. But they also lose 2 linebackers and 1 in the secondary. So this defense is taking a bit of a hit. You lose 5 starters. But overall, this offense could easily decline. Of course, with losing your top 2 wide receivers, that could be trouble. But then again, if Trevon Grimes and Kyle Pitts rise up to the occasion and they have a good season, I think this Florida team could easily get back to 10 or 11 wins. But of course, there are a lot of question marks still on this team, especially with Pirine losing, or actually being graduated. So that's going to be once again a tough loss. Of course, he had almost 1,000 yards. So when you lose a big playmaker like that, it can be a bit of a problem going into the next season. But the defense could continue to improve. No doubt about it. You do lose 5 starters, but overall, 5 starters is that's kind of moderate. Especially the 2 linebackers, that's probably what's going to hurt the most on this team, especially. Looking at your schedule for the first time now for Florida, you start off the season September 5th against Eastern Washington. Then the next week, you got a conference game against Kentucky. Should be an interesting game there. On September 19th, they play South Alabama. On September 26th, then it's a travel to Tennessee, which Tennessee is going to be a team to watch out for next season, in my opinion. And I'll go over that in my schedule preview for them coming out in about a week. Watch out for Tennessee. South Carolina, then the next week, they get LSU at home, so that's going to be good. Then they face Ole Miss on the road. They play Georgia at home. Vanderbilt on the road, Missouri, New Mexico State at home, then finish off the season at Florida State. So overall, they play most of their tough opponents at home. Of course, LSU they got at home, Georgia they got at home, Missouri, they got them at home as well. I'm not saying that Missouri is going to be a tough opponent, but of course, they'll be okay next season. But Tennessee will probably be your toughest road game, I'd have to assume, unless Florida State pulls something out and they have a really good season. But overall, I mean, for Florida, there's several winnable games in here. I think they will be able to upset either LSU or Georgia. I'm not sure who, but of course, they get both those games at home, so watch out for one of those games. But in the end, I think Florida goes either 8-4 or 10-2, or they will get a record somewhere in there, so they'll either get 8, 9, or 10 wins. Overall, I mean, this Florida team should be bound for another good season, but of course, once again, they do have a couple of tough losses, especially on the offensive side. It'll be interesting to see how Kyle Trask adjusts to that. If he can adjust well, if he can play good or play well this season, I think that this Florida team, it definitely is bound for another 10 or 11 win season. But in the end, looking at the regular season, I think they take 2 losses. Of course, I mean, once again, you've got a tougher schedule. You have to play both LSU and Georgia. You don't have to play Alabama, so that's good. But yeah, of course, Tennessee, that could be a tougher game. South Carolina, and there's that stretch from about late September all the way through October. That could be a tough stretch. But overall, November looks pretty good for Florida. I think that your 4 guaranteed wins or your 4 projected wins for me right now are Eastern Washington, South Alabama, Missouri, and then New Mexico State. So overall, I'm not going to be predicting all of the games in our schedule previews. I'll be doing that in our actual predictions, so be sure to stay tuned for that. That will be coming out in a few months after the spring games and everything goes down and we get closer to the season and we start to learn more about what the teams will look like as we get closer to the season. But that is it for this schedule preview for Florida. Let me know your early thoughts on Florida in the comments below. Once again, it is really late in January and we're still very early on. We've only been in the offseason for about a week and a half now. So overall, still got a lot of time, but let me know your thoughts in the comments below on Florida's schedule preview. But thank you guys all for watching. Show some support if you'd like to. Stick around for more content, and I will see you all later.